Hello, class. Welcome to the first segment in the week 7 material. And the primary topic that we're going to cover this week is going to be with how to read information from a file into a variable in a Python program. But we're also going to cover some other useful tidbits of information that you will hopefully find beneficial moving forward. But the first thing that we're going to cover is how we can work with external files and how we can read the contents of those files into a Python program. That is, we can read the contents of those files into a variable within our Python program. And then once we have those contents in our program, then maybe we can do something with that. And usually this is going to be in the form of reading in the contents of, say, some sort of data set, that's contained in an external file, read all that information into a Python program, and then go about the process of pulling out the necessary data points that you're interested in analyzing, and then have a program then go about the analysis. And that'll be something that'll be part of a specific homework question where you'll be asked to read in information from what is more or less a spreadsheet file and to calculate some basic statistics for that particular data set. Now, the two main operations that we're going to be looking at is the idea of reading information in from a file, but we're also going to briefly discuss how to write information to a file. And that'll be something we cover in the next segment. For now, I want to focus on getting some definitions straight and also just focus on the idea of reading information in from a file in the first place. So the actual process of reading in the information from a file can be accomplished a couple different ways. The first of which is a very quick and dirty method, which I have written here on line 2. And this might look somewhat familiar because we discussed or we demonstrated this to some extent in the last week's unit when we introduced the idea of built-in Python functions and we demonstrated the idea of an open function or of the open function. And now we're going to actually see how that comes into play when we explore the idea of reading in files, which will be the main topic for this week. So you can see I have the same, excuse me. So you can see we have the same open function that we had demonstrated in last week's unit. And the way that you put information into the open function, the first value that you put in is the name of the file that you want to actually access, whose contents you actually want to access and read it into your Python program. And the second value that you put into the open function is a character sequence that basically tells the computer how you want to access that file. By putting a lowercase r in here, this means that we want to read in the contents of our file. But as you'll see down here in the notes here, you'll see there's 4 main values that we can plug in for that second argument in the open function. So here we demonstrate the r, which basically just means we're going to read in that information. Now, when we put a w in there, we actually are going to be opening that file for the purposes of writing information to it. And this is going to be, this actually has some things you want to be careful about, and we'll emphasize those in the next segment. But there's also some other modes, which we're not going to specifically explore in this class, but there's a couple other modes that you can deal with as well. One is this one called RB, which means read binary. For our intents and purposes, there's a more technical difference between the two of them. But for our intents and purposes, a regular text file, which is what the R and the W are designed to handle, when you open a regular text file, the contents will be very readable to the human eye. In fact, we can kind of go ahead and demonstrate that. So if you were to open a text file, a regular text file in your favorite text editor, whatever that might be, whether that's Microsoft Notepad or Apple's TextEdit, when you open the contents, you can see it is nice and readable to the human eye. There's something intelligible that we can actually make sense of. And I want to contrast that to a binary file where if you open this in some sort of regular text editor where it will just show you the raw contents of the file, if you open a binary file, which would be something like either a JPEG or some sort of image file, uh, this looks like it's just a whole bunch of weird stuff going on. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot that we can make very good sense out of. It just looks like a whole bunch of strange symbols. And this would be what you would get if you try to open some sort of binary file. There may be parts of this that are readable to some extent to the human eye, but most of the file is just going to look like it's just a bunch of nonsense, and there doesn't seem to really be anything useful that we can look at inside the file. So that's just sort of a very basic and perhaps oversimplified definition of a text file versus a binary file. You open a text file and it's nice and readable to the human eye. The contents of the file are nice and readable to the human eye. You open a binary file and not so much the case. So that's what I mean by a plain text file versus some sort of a binary file. And the main thing that we're going to worry about in this class specifically is just plain text files. We will look at as some sort of binary file a little bit later on, but we're not actually going to be using these modes to access it, and we'll get to that. That'll be towards the end when we talk about netcdf files. That'll be towards the end of the class. But for this week, you only have to worry about handling plain text files, and so that means you only have to worry about knowing what happens when you put a lowercase r in here and what happens when you put a lowercase w, and also make sure that's in quotation marks so that it's not mistaken for a variable. And essentially what this all does here on line 2 is this opens the file whose name we have here. And what all this rigmarole does is it goes into the file and it takes each individual line inside the file and puts it as an element in a Python list. So this entire thing on line 2 will just create a Python list. Here on the right hand side, it will create a Python list, and each entry in the Python list will be a separate file, a separate line that appears in the file that we've supplied here. And this entire Python list will go in this variable called lines, again, which we have defined on the left hand side. And if we want to sort of verify that this is in fact like some sort of Python list, so here I'll say pick out the 0th item out of the Python list. And it looks like I got nothing. But if you take a close look here, you'll see this is basically a Python program that's reading in its own contents. But if each individual line gets its own entry in a Python list, then if we go through this line by line, we can see we have line 1 has absolutely nothing on it, and that's the reason why we got nothing appearing in the console here. But if this line here does in fact something on it, and if we want to, we can see it does in fact print out that exact line here. And in fact, if we want to see what the entire list looks like, we can also do that. And there you can see, if you look very carefully here and pick out the quotation marks, you can see how each individual entry inside of this Python list can be married up to a separate line that appears inside of our Python program. So that's a quick and dirty way of accomplishing that. We could also do something that's a little bit less concise, but it's a little bit more intelligible, a little bit more readable as to what exactly is going on here. And this kind of also introduces a concept that we'll cover in the next segment as well. But one thing that we could also do to do the same thing, we can break this up into a 3-step process. So we can have a variable set equal to the open function. So this is the same open function that I have up here, except now I'm actually taking this open function and storing it into a variable. Now, this might seem kind of strange at first, but essentially all this does is it allows us to take a file, some sort of external file, whatever that might be, and sort of assign a variable to it. So that in this case, this variable is called the file. That way, whenever whatever this variable appears in our Python program, the computer knows we're talking about the file name that we more or less assign to it. So that's the whole idea behind setting a variable equal to the open function. This way, Python knows that when it sees this variable, it knows we're talking about something that's related to the file name that we put in the open function itself. And then if we take that variable that we've defined and say .read, that basically tells the computer, take this file that we've put in this variable name here and read its contents. And again, that just goes, we have another variable that holds on to that. This variable in this case is called contents. And to split everything up onto its own line, we take the string that we get back from this. And that's something that's really important. We should really emphasize. By default, when you read information in from a file, a plain text file, everything, even if there are numbers in there, everything is treated as text by default. So if you have numbers in there that you want the computer to interpret as numbers, then you have to start using the casting functions that we talked about at the end of the week 6 unit. But that's something that's very important to keep in mind. When you read information in from a plain text file, everything by default is treated as a string, is treated as text. So if you have numbers embedded within the text, then you're going to have to use the casting functions to tell the computer, I want these numbers treated as numbers. I don't want these numbers treated as some sort of string. But we get a string back from this, and that goes on the left-hand side, this equal sign. And here we have a funny little thing, contents.split. We're going to talk a lot more about the split function towards the end of this weekly unit. But right now, all we have to worry about, all I'm just going to say right now is that this takes the string contents and splits up each individual line so that each individual line goes into the Python list. Each individual entry in the Python list will be a separate line. That's what we accomplish here on line 7. It's just somewhat of a less concise approach than what we used on line 2, but all three of these things do exactly the same, both of the techniques that I showed you do the exact same thing. So if I do this bit on line 2, that gives me the exact same result. And if I do this here on lines 5, 6, and 7, I also get the same exact result. And I can prove it by just simply having the computer print out lines. You can see I get the same exact output, more or less, that I had before. So if those are in fact a Python list, then we could use a for loop like this one to access each individual entry in the Python list. So here we're just using this looping variable L to individually access each individual entry in lines. Hopefully you remember this type of for loop from the week 5 unit. And here we just simply print out what's an L, and L is going to be our looping variable that one by one assumes every entry in the Python list called lines. And you can see it just simply reads the contents of this Python program, reads in its own contents and just spits them back out into the console. Now let's say that we actually want to work with an actual external file and not just this Python program. So here I'm going to try and read in a file called example.txt. And if I go to my little file navigator here, you'll notice that here's the name of my program. And you can see how the tab here shows you what the name of your program is. And you'll also notice that in the same folder, this folder called week 7, notice how in this folder I have my Python program, w7p1.py. That is my Python program that is going to be reading in files. So notice how my Python program is in the same folder as the file that I'm trying to access. So notice how my Python program, w7p1.py, resides in the same folder as the file that I'm trying to access here. The file I'm trying to access is example.txt, and my Python program, w7p1.py, is trying to access this file called example.txt, and you'll notice both of those files appear in the same folder. And that's something that when you're first learning this is something that you'll definitely want to keep in mind. Make sure your Python program is in the same folder as the file that you're trying to read in using the open function. If the computer cannot find your file, then you'll get an error message in the console, and we can actually demonstrate what that error message looks like. But if we want to, we can just run through this program again. So it does the same thing, just with the contents of a different file. So we're specifically reading in this particular text file. And you'll notice how, I'll actually go ahead and close out of that because we don't need that anymore. You'll notice how each individual line does in fact match up with something that appears in the console here. We did the same exact thing, just with a different text file. And if I want to demonstrate what happens if I try to access a file that the computer cannot find, then you will get this error message appearing in the console, file not found error, no such file or directory. And if you ever see this error message, there's a couple things that you definitely want to check. First, proofread your file name and make sure the file name is exactly matching the name that you put in here. Make sure that exactly matches the name of the file that you actually want to read in. Second thing you want to check is make sure the Python program and the file you're trying to read in are in fact in the same folder. So again, my Python program is called w7p1.py, which is what we have open in Spider right now. And the file that I was trying to read in earlier, example.txt, those are in fact in the same folder. And another thing that you really will need to watch out for is a lot of file navigation systems will delete the extent or hide the extension whenever you're going to navigate, whether it's Finder or the Windows desktop or whatever it might be. Sometimes it will actually hide the extension here, and that can be something that can get kind of confusing. So if I go to name an extension and I say hide extension, so now you'll notice that this file, I don't see the .txt here. Now, if I try to do this, if I try to put the name in here that matches up with what we have over here in the file navigation, so now it looks like the file is called example. So if I try to do this, it's going to tell me error, no such file or directory. And if you encounter this, and you'll see that the name is exactly the same, but the issue here is there's an extension that you can't see. So make sure when you're going to plug in the name of the file, make sure you plug in the file name and the extension in order to get it to work properly. Otherwise, you're going to get this error message over and over again, and it might be really frustrating, especially if you forget what I just told you. But that's going to do it for this first segment on working with external files. And in the next segment, we will explore how to write information to a file. So with that, I will see you all in the next segment.